Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
As per usual, you are we are traded places, and you are the one who is celebrating the birth of our Savior. And people who are listening to this may not be able to see, but you've got a beautiful Christmas tree. It looks very festive where you are.
Hand chopped, chopped by my own
yes,
hands. I cut myself on the saw for true authenticity.
Outclassed me, out-Christian me, and out-conservative me once again. And it looks beautiful.
Well,
this is gorgeous.
Thank you very much. You can't see it. I also have the menorah out of the frame. So it's a Christmas year, as you may know.
I'm all down with that. I was telling my boys about Hanukkah, and I even, we watched a video that taught kids about it. About the Maccabees and all that, and then I played them Adam Sandler's.
Should I be saying Happy Holidays to you, Matt? Not Merry Christmas. I don't want to offend.
I feel like as a very flawed but a believing Christian that celebrating Hanukkah or certainly Passover would only enhance my experience. But I also played them Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song. And of course, they don't know who David Lee Roth is. David Lee Roth likes them, or Hall of Famer Rod Carew, but they still enjoyed it.
That truly fascinates me. I grew up. Not only do I have Jewish ancestry, but I grew up in a very Jewish community. So, the sentiment of that song, just feels real. I wouldn't think anyone outside of a Jewish community would even the song wouldn't really resonate. Just telling a list of people who are Jewish wouldn't be very interesting.
Yeah.
But for someone who's been around Jewish people, I get where that sentiment of having to sort of prove yourself and you're part of a society comes from.
Yeah.
But you get the message of the song.
Well, and I think everyone. I mean, that was a hugely popular skit on Saturday Night Live. I think. I didn't see it, but Adam Sandler did a cartoon called 8 Crazy Nights, right, which I assume is loosely based on it.
Right.
I think everyone got it. And, he sets it up with the premise, which is when Christmas comes along, sometimes we feel left out. Mm-hmm. So I'm writing this song for kids like me. Mm-hmm. And so I think it really worked. And it's funny, the smoke your marijuana. It was very well done.
Well, he doesn't. I don't think he says that line in the original SNL performance of it, if I remember correctly. I think that was done. I think that was for the live performance.
Well, the one I saw was Weekend Update, hosted by Kevin Nealon.
Right.
And Sandler comes out with an acoustic guitar and does it. So I don't know if that was the original.
I think it's the original. I thought he said "Don't smoke marijuana" in the SNL.
You're right. That's what it is.
Yeah,
that's what it is. It's "Don't smoke," right? Right. So my kid, my oldest boy Burke, has really taken to we haven't watched it live together, but Saturday Night Live, he loves comedy, and we listen to a lot of. I'm going to try to take him to see Jim Gaffigan when he's on this new Pale Tourist tour, I think. So I don't know if he's going to be a comedian or something, but he digs it. So.
Excellent. Well, we should talk about news of the day. And
you're all the buzzkill who takes away from the holiday cheer.
Matt, as a card-carrying member of the Resistance, Matt K. Lewis, isn't impeachment Christmas coming early for you?
Well, I will say this, and I tweeted this on Impeachment Day. I understand why Nancy Pelosi has to say that it's a somber day and that she's sad. I was sad when the Republicans nominated Trump. I was somber when he was elected president. To me, Impeachment Day isn't really a cause for sadness. I'm not saying that I was throwing a party or anything, but I see it as more like justice finally being served, at least a small slice of justice.
So as the true Americans have said, secular leftists like you have been pining for this day since he was first inaugurated, and this whole thing is a travesty and a sham and a farce.
Well, it's easy for you to say that wrapped around the American flag with a Christmas tree behind you. But yes, I always thought that, that Trump Trump has deserved impeachment a long time. I will say this, though. I wrote a few columns at The Beast chastising the left. I think it was Rashida Tlaib who said on day one, impeach the MFer.
Right.
I'm pretty sure I wrote a column condemning her, probably both for profanity and incivility, and also for being premature, and also making it harder. She actually made it harder for people like Nancy Pelosi to ultimately do what had to be done. So,
but this has to feel weird for you, and you have been, a loyal soldier for the conservative movement, your whole adult life, and here you are with a twinge of excitement that obviously we know he is unorthodox, but by and large, a conservative president, cutting taxes, appointing conservative judges, and here you are excited at the prospect that that there is at least the technical possibility he'd be ousted from office. Is this disorienting to you in some way?
Well, yeah, it is. Of course, this has been a process. It's not like I woke up yesterday and decided that I was going to be a NeverTrumper or criticize my team. This has been going on for years now, and it's been a slow evolution. But it is weird, and I just have to, just a couple of examples. So I had a book idea, a book proposal that I pitched to some major publishers through my agents, and it wasn't really going to work, but maybe it would work with a religious publisher. And then that just didn't happen. And I was telling a smart friend, and he's like, well, of course religious publishers aren't going to touch you. You're anti-Trump. And I was like, oh, that, you don't realize that there's a conservative organization that I've done some stuff with. And, I reached out to them recently about doing something and haven't heard back yet. Who knows? But you always wonder, maybe could I blame them for not wanting, if they decided that I was toxic, that would actually make a lot of sense, right? And so there's a professional career sacrifice aspect to this potentially, but also just, I think, naturally speaking, another example, there are people that I was friends with, that I worked with, and we've come down on different sides of this, and it strains the relationship. So it's a weird thing, but ultimately, I'm pretty confident that I'm right, so I'm okay with it.
So the friends you have, obviously, I'm not going to ask you to name names, who are in the business, who are sticking with Trump. When you're having a private conversation with them, are they just sort of the same in private as in public? Salute our dear leader, and I don't want to, and don't accept any criticism, or do they say, "Look, I know he does these things, and the Russia's weird, I know, but come on, he's still our guy. We got to stick by our guy." Which way does it usually fall?
It varies, but mainly there are people who take either tack. But honestly, mainly it's been estrangement. We haven't seen one another. I mean, I'll just give you one example, which I don't think I'll be betraying any confidences or anything to say. But so one of the people that I worked with at the Daily Caller for 6 years is a guy named Vince Colonnese, who's a great guy. He was one of my editors, and he's now one of the hosts of a morning show, a very popular morning show here in Washington, D.C., WMAL. And Vince is much more Trumpy than I am, and he's also the host of a conservative radio show, which is, very popular. And his producer reached out to me to come on. I have this email newsletter, and my latest email newsletter, I talked about the importance of, so Kat Timpf who is a conservative TV personality, had a tweet saying, like, I'm not going to put up a Christmas tree. It's such a hassle. And so my email newsletter this week was all about, like, everything's a hassle. Like anything that brings long-term joy or tradition, like having a Thanksgiving dinner is a pain in the ass. Taking your kids to church on Sunday morning is like very difficult. Like it's easier to just stay home and watch Netflix than to go to a Broadway musical. Like, but anything you do that like builds community, bonding, joy, memories is a hassle. And I got invited on that show to talk about it. And my first instinct was like, I'm not going to go on this show because it's going to be the day that they impeach Trump. You know what I mean? And they're going to like want to argue with me about that. And like, I just don't see the benefit. So, initially I kind of demurred, but then Vince texted me. This is a testament to Vince. So he's like, I want to have you on to talk about holidays and the importance of holiday tradition. And, so as the first time I talked to him in months was on air. And to his credit, we had a great conversation just about Christmas and the importance of celebrating and going and actually doing traditions. But the point is that I felt that estrangement, or I felt weird about it. Whereas in the old days, going on a conservative radio show would have been like right up my alley. You know? I wouldn't have had to think about it. So, yeah.
Do you have, or I mean, are there people that you talk to?
Way, sorry to interrupt, but the other aspect that I forgot to bring up in this is I literally had a column that went up yesterday morning, the day that I did the radio show, attacking Mark Levin, criticizing Mark Levin, who is also a host on WMAL. So like I was like, this could go wrong in a lot of ways.
Now, are you in contact with other conservative NeverTrumpers who is there a small community of those who are sort of keeping that faith and are turning to each other for support in this time of trial?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a meeting that I don't go to. The Niskanen Center has a meeting of the concerned, or what, I don't know what it is, but like I'm not a meeting guy. It's like Adam Carolla always says, like, about being an atheist. Like if I wanted to go to meetings, I wouldn't be an atheist, you know. So like I'm partly a NeverTrumper because I'm a contrarian, like who's not a team player. If I wanted to be a team player, I would support Donald Trump, right? And so I'm like a rugged individualist in this regard. So I don't go to those meetings. But I will say, like, one of my best friends is Jamie Weinstein. He and I have lunch whenever he's in town, like once a week, and that helps. But mostly it's probably done via like my podcast and remotely. People like John Ziegler, who's a frequent guest on Matt Lewis and the News podcast, and just on Twitter. I listen to the Bulwark podcast with Charlie Sykes all the time, and he has a lot of NeverTrump guests on. And so most of it's done not necessarily by meeting people face to face.
And so do you feel like you're going to be on the right side of history within the Republican Party and the conservative movement? That at some point everyone else is going to see the light and you'll be welcomed back into the fold eventually, or do you just not even worry about what's going to happen down the line?
Yeah, I'm not worried about that. I think that's possible, and that would be preferable, but probably not that likely. I've just decided to do what I think is right, and I don't think of myself anymore as being, and like I'm borrowing this from David Frum, but I've heard him say this before, but I think there's truth to it, is like he used to think of himself as being a conservative. Now he sees himself as being conservative. Mm-hmm. And so when I look at people that like other writers that I respect, like Chuck Klosterman, who is, a great writer, Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. He was the New York Times ethicist for a while. And, he's a guy who actually is very conservative, in his worldview, but nobody would ever think of him as a conservative or part of the conservative movement. And that's kind of, I think, where I've ended up is like, I think I'm a conservative person. I think I have a conservative worldview, a temperament. But I don't think that fits anymore in the conservative movement, which is actually a radical movement that believes in tearing down the founding fathers and our past presidents. And it believes in things like moral relativism and that you should find your truth because there is no objective truth. Mm-hmm. That's today's Republican Party. That's today's conservative movement. So I didn't leave them. They left me.
So were you watching a good deal of the debate yesterday?
Watching and listening to. Some of it's listening to it. And I heard someone say, I think it was, I forget who, it was a NeverTrumper, say that listening to it had a different, brought like a sort of a different perspective. And so I was either watching it or listening to it. And I have to say, I'm going to just tell you my perspective. I hope it's not offensive to people who are liberals or Democrats because it's not meant to be. But I feel like the parties have switched. Like, I feel like I used to view the Democrats and the left and liberals as being engaging in intellectually dishonest arguments, invoking emotion, maudlin arguments that were actually offended my intelligence and that were pandering and that were really went against everything I believe in. Now I hear Democrats talking about the founding fathers, talking about civility, talking about decency and faith. And I hear Republicans making really ridiculous, offensive arguments about like Pontius Pilate and, you know, comparing Donald Trump to Jesus. And from my perspective, and again, maybe this is just my perspective, but if I'm being honest, from my perspective, I feel like they've switched sides. And I don't know if it's just me or if they really have, but that is honestly my sense.
So I was curious if you were listening to the Democrats saying to yourself, oh man, I can't believe the people I'm mixed up with now. How did I end up here?
No, here's the deal. You're
even talking like Joe Biden now.
That's a bunch of malarkey. No, here's the deal. Look, I have no illusions about this. Like, I fully expect that whenever there's a Democratic president, I'm going to have to really switch and focus on standing up and stopping the left. You know, I haven't changed my mind about the left, you know, identity politics, abortion on demand, like all that. So I haven't changed my mind about that. And I fully expect at some point I'm going to have to turn and focus 90% of my attention on stopping them. But at this moment right now, when you look at what is the most pressing thing that we should be concerned about, it's Donald Trump. And although I think, you know, AOC and Tlaib and Omar are still crazy and horrible, they have receded, much to their credit and Nancy Pelosi's credit. And the Democratic Party that is front and center right now, for the time being, is more decent, more honest, more sane. You know, I wrote a piece the other week calling the Democratic base the silent majority, and basically making the argument that Republican elites and establishment types were more decent than the Republican base, while the Democratic base is actually more decent than the Democratic leadership. By that, I don't mean Pelosi, but I mean the chattering classes and the elites and the people like the blue check marks on Twitter. And in today's day and age, it's the base that matters. And so for whatever reason, it feels to me like the most decent salt of the earth people are Democratic voters who didn't go along with the radical leftward shift that I feared they were going to go along with early on.
So when you're saying base, you're not saying the Democratic Socialist faction of the party.
No. I'm talking about the people who decided, hey, we're going to stay with Joe Biden, whether you like it or not. And so there's a huge dichotomy between the progressive left, the woke Twitter people, whom I still abhor, and the rank and file, salt of the earth, Democrat base voter, who is much more moderate and sensible than anybody in the Republican Party right now. I think they're more. I think the Democrats, in some ways, are more conservative.
Now,
we
do need to see
if Nancy Pelosi were to be consistent on her Catholic faith and take it to the final, go all in. Who knows where I would go?
Well, you probably shouldn't hold your breath on that. But I mean, I do think we need to see, if you don't mind me shifting gears a little bit towards, the primary. I do think, and I was the guy, I've been writing since the day AOC won the primary in June of 2018 that the available data showed that the party was not as left as this one victory would suggest, because even on that day in and of itself, there were moderates winning other primaries in more purple areas. And I stayed on that message through the primary season. I pointed out on November 2018, on that election day, who the candidates that won those races, and I wrote an early primary article, is the left misreading the Democratic electorate? That came out soon after Biden had announced and had his initial spike. But of course, it wasn't just about him having a spike. There was a ton of other data, other poll numbers by the Democratic Party, where the folks that won in 2018, where they're coming down on Medicare for all. This was all available data last year and early this year, and yet so many people on the left, so many professional Democrats. I mean, how many
candidates?
The candidates, the people, their staffs,
the people running for president,
right,
made the bet.
Yes,
that the most progressive person would have a better chance of winning.
Right, and so many people made this mistake, even though the data was available to find. I had some secret stash of data. But I think
I never thought. So I never disputed the data. My point always was that the people with the megaphone, with the energy, would ultimately change the minds or outmuscle the silent majority, as I call them.
Yeah, and it may have been if there wasn't a candidate like Biden who was willing to, who felt like I have the stature and a base of support to allow me to go against that tide. If there wasn't a candidate like that, perhaps the louder voices would overwhelm what looks to be a silent majority within the Democratic Party. Now, again, we aren't done with this process yet. I don't want to say Sanders or Warren can't win because they still, if one could really elbow out the other and win a plurality in Iowa and New Hampshire, and if Biden made, one gaffe too many, who knows what might happen. But we do have a lot of data from the beginning of this primary to now, which still, I mean, if you add up Sanders Warren and you add up Biden, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Bloomberg, you get a bigger slice of the party that is leaning to the moderate pragmatist side than towards the populist socialist side. So I still would put my money there. And just today in Politico, Ryan Lizza had a big profile piece on Biden's inner circle, which talked about how there was a bit of a dichotomy between his longtime loyalists going back decades and the newer folks who were come on who are younger. And those staff, the younger staff, are pulling, hey, you gotta run left. You gotta be with the zeitgeist. And probably Biden said to folks, after the midterm, they're wrong. I was stumping in the swing districts, and I saw who won those races, and this is why I need to be who I am and plant my flag there. I can't take sole credit. The candidate also seemed to know this as well. But we do. He does seem to have recognized that there is. I mean, you can't say the social left doesn't exist in the Democratic Party. It certainly does, and it's louder than it was 8 years ago. It doesn't mean it's the majority of the party or it's where the true base of the party. I mean, everyone talks about how African American women are the base of the party, which in many cases is true. But African Americans have been part of the moderate bulwark of the party, as we've seen in this race so far.
Totally. It's so interesting. I think I overestimated Republican-based voters. I thought they were more decent and discerning than they were. The Republican voters disappointed me. I really was surprised. And I think Democrat-based voters have impressed me. They have exceeded my expectations of them. And I had a bias. I was obviously biased against them. I thought they were more liberal, more progressive, more crazy. And I thought they would end up being brought along toward the socialist radical side. And they didn't. They stood up to their elites. It's been a very weird thing for me to go through this, as you know.
Well, I was going to say two things in response to that. As you recall, I humiliated myself in 2016 when I predicted that Jeb was going to be the nominee. And I did that in part because that was my experience watching Republicans in 2008 and 2012. That the caricature of the Republican-based voter wasn't matching with what they did when they voted in the primaries. Obviously, the faction existed. The Rush Limbaughs of the world tried to stop John McCain and tried to stop Mitt Romney, but they couldn't. So I assumed that the center of the party, the Republican Party, was, I might have some sympathies over here, but we got to, be reasonable and rational and try to win this thing.
Yeah.
And I did not detect that there was a disgust with how those two the McCain and Romney campaigns went, that propelled them to, bet it all on Trump. So, I mean, things can change. Past behavior doesn't predict future behavior. But in this case with the Democrats, there was available data that was recent to suggest that even though there was a trend towards aggressive socialism and populism, and you shouldn't pretend it doesn't exist, it wasn't overwhelming the entire party.
So I think just to sort of unpack it, I feel like I had much higher expectations for the Republican base and grassroots, and they disappointed me. So I thought, well, number one, I have no expectations of the Democrats and the Democratic base. So number one, I already start off with low expectations. And number two, they're going to follow the same trend. There's a trend toward populism. There's a trend toward extremism or radicalism and also Europeanization in a sense, whether it's on the right or on the socialist left. And so I assumed that the Democrats would respond in kind in a very negative, disappointing way, and they surprised me so far. That they're the silent majority of Democratic voters who are more moderate and sensible and pragmatic, and they may come down to be the people who are holding the country together, which would be really ironic from my standpoint.
I mean, I do think there's still a big generational split in the Democratic Party, and the generational split bleeds into ideology and tactics, which you saw very starkly in 2016 because it was a two-person race. And it's Hillary crushed it with the older vote, and Bernie crushed it with the younger vote. And now you're seeing a more complex, fragmented party with so many candidates, so many places for people to go. But you do still see, that generational split where Bernie still does extremely well with younger voters, and Warren holds her own there also, whereas Biden and Buttigieg do very well with older voters. And this is just one anecdote, so I can't hang too much on this, but there's someone who I know well who is older than me and was a Bernie voter in 2016, but was very unnerved with the degree of polarization that occurred, upon Trump winning. And I don't know where his sympathy is now with who he's voting for. I haven't talked to him about it, but even though he's a hard left guy in many ways, like seeing that, made him pause. And I imagine just there's an element of experience in life. I mean, if you are 30 and under, you've only seen so much politics. You've only seen Democrats get rolled by Mitch McConnell with Merrick Garland, and so that's something that really sticks in your craw and think, well, there's no point trying to be civil with these people. It's a sucker's game, and if you've been around for the Reagan years and the Nixon years and the polarization of the 60s, what's happening now is still terrible, but you have other points of reference to look to that you experienced yourself. And as strong as the youth vote is in the Democratic Party, it is not as big as the older vote. There are more voters, 45 and over than 45 and under. And that's why Hillary beat Bernie, and that's why, Biden's got a great shot at pulling this thing out.
Absolutely. It's been such an interesting time, so weird. But, again, there's reason for hope and optimism, at this darkest time of year, Bill. Sometimes miracles happen.
So so this is Thursday morning. This is before the Democratic debate. Actually, before I get to the Democrats, before I get to the primary debate, I want one more impeachment topic I want to address with you, which is it a good idea for Nancy Pelosi to slow walk and possibly even not deliver at all the articles of impeachment to the Senate? Just so folks know, in the Senate rules, once the articles are delivered, the Senate is automatically in trial. They can't do anything else until they get out of trial. There was a push bubbling up. I think Lawrence Tribe, who's the constitutional professor, laid out an argument for not handing it over right away and negotiating the terms of the trial, which at least initially Pelosi seems to have accepted and said, we're not seeing a fair trial being structured over there, so we'll wait and see what happens. Is this a smart tactic by Pelosi?
Well, first of all, you and I had a related argument a couple weeks ago right here in the DMZ where I made the argument that Democrats should not be in a rush, that Democrats should try to compel Rudy Giuliani and Bolton and Pompeo and others to testify, and that going through that, even if they were to expedite the appeals process, that could take months, but it may, number one, they may have an opportunity now that would disappear once impeachment's over, right? Because they might not have the same standing to compel them, and that it could be a game changer. And so you took the other view, which is to say, by dragging it out, it risks Democrats being labeled as it becomes too close to the 2020 reelection.
Looks like you're playing political games.
And maybe my argument against it, negotiating against myself here, would be, the longer Democrats wait, the better the argument for just letting the voters decide becomes. So this is a tough one. It really is.
Well, I think this is different than just having more investigation before deciding to impeach. This is, you have decided to impeach, and the natural order of things is you have formally requested Senate to have a trial, and then it seems like you're backing off of that. Are you opening yourself up to Republicans saying you're afraid to actually have Trump be acquitted? You're afraid to see the process go forward. You're proving this is a political game because you only want to do this halfway and take your ball and go home.
I think the only way this works is, I believe it was Charlie Sykes at the Bulwark, it might have been Jonathan V. Last, somebody, maybe it was Bill Kristol, somebody wrote a piece about how if you were to get like a gang of 6 Mitt Romney, a couple of other, who knows who they would be, but some Republicans, get them together with Chris Coons and a couple of Democrats and have them say, because here's the problem. Mitch McConnell can't do anything apparently unless he has 51 votes. And so if you were to have some Republicans say, we're not going to vote with you, Mitch, unless you agree to these terms, which we think are fair, then then Pelosi would have some leverage. But I think unless you can get maybe 3 Republicans or whatever to sign on to this in the Senate, I don't think there's much reason for Pelosi to not refer it. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
Where I think
in other words, I don't think Pelosi in and of herself has leverage, because McConnell could just say, "Hey, hold it, send it over when you're ready," and so I think at that point Pelosi loses. But if there were some Republicans on the record saying she's not asking for anything radical, we've carved out a compromise that would be a fair trial that we think would be credible, then all of a sudden I think the dynamic changes.
Where I think that logic is going to falter, and look, it's hard to find a more stout Pelosi defender than me. I was Team Pelosi all the way, when they were trying to oust her from getting the speaker's gavel again, and I do think she is an exceptional tactician, and I would not expect her to stick with a tactic that's not working. So my guess is she will find this tactic is not going to work and will abandon it fairly quickly. I think the problem with hanging your hat on hoping to get a few waiver Republicans to side with you on this is, if you're Susan Collins, if you're Cory Gardner, what you want most of all is to not have to take a vote. So Pelosi sitting on the articles of impeachment is great for them, and I'm sure Mitch McConnell is sensitive to them, and he doesn't want them to take votes either. So McConnell can say, A, you're afraid to go through the process, and allowing us to prove that Trump didn't do anything wrong, and at the same time, my moderate senators are shielded from having to take a tough vote that could split their constituencies at home. So I mean, there's a principle in negotiation called the BATNA. What's better than a negotiated alternative? And so without a better alternative to a negotiated agreement. I'm sorry. And to not have a negotiated agreement in this case is to not have a trial. And so Democrats can say, well, he was impeached. He's got that scarlet eye on him forever. And Republicans can say, that's because you were afraid to finish the process and go through the trial, and you're playing games. I don't think Democrats get the better of that argument. I mean, it's not. But
I don't think that's even a scenario. There's not even. I mean, they're gonna send it to the Senate at some point. Well, the question is, do you do it today or do you do it?
But the holdout is a threat, supposedly a threat that you don't have to do that. I mean, that's the only way you gain leverage through delay is if Republicans are nervous that you will never hand them over, and they don't like the idea of Trump ending this process, just being impeached and not getting the acquittal. If that upset them, then they would be interested in making concessions to avoid that outcome. If everyone agrees they're going to get it anyway, then what are you even talking about here?
Yeah, but maybe I'm wrong. Isn't it? You mentioned like Cory Gardner, right? I mean, Democrats. It's to Democrats' advantage to force senators to go on the record. Right?
I would say so. I mean, to the extent. I think the politics of this is not clear cut. I don't think ultimately impeachment is what gets Democrats the White House. I don't even think we're going to be talking about impeachment come November 2020.
Might get him some in the Congress, though. I mean, it may cost him in the House, but someone told me, I forget who it was. I can't mention them anyway. But somebody smart told me that Cory Gardner's gone already. Like
I think he's got a very tough road, particularly if he's up against Hickenlooper, who's very strong in Colorado. So yeah, Democrats have taken a risk for their 30-plus House members in Trump-won districts, and the only way that possibly evens the score is if you could knock out Susan Collins and Cory Gardner by making them take a vote that's not helpful in their own states.
Martha McSally.
I mean, Arizona, maybe, it's a tougher state. It's not as blue.
You were just out there scoping out the political landscape.
I was.
So.
In fact, I even talked to a conservative person out there who said, man, all these folks from California coming into our state and making us blue, are they going to pull us too far to the left? And I was like, well, what you got, that was Kirsten Sinema, not, AOC. So, I mean, Arizona is hardly, a blue, capital B blue state, but yeah, Democrats are competitive there. But Sinema might well vote to exonerate Trump. She doesn't even go to party caucus meetings, from what I understand. She's trying to play things very down the middle, whereas...
Or she could just do what Tulsi Gabbard did and vote present.
Right, I mean, she could do something...
Did you see people were lauding this as a profile in courage?
Well,
I don't get it.
Well, I think like the 5 people in the world who are dire Tulsi defenders were lauding as a profile in courage. I don't think most folks saw it that way.
But they're all on Twitter.
So. Arlen Specter in the Clinton impeachment, he voted not proven, which is like a Scottish law term, which doesn't even count in American political systems. Sinema could do something like that, but Colorado is pretty blue. And Maine, I mean, Trump did win the Maine 2nd congressional district. It's like there are Trumpers there, but statewide, it's a pretty blue state, and it went blue in 2018. It's not necessarily Susan Collins. Yeah. Her brand is that she's not a partisan Republican. So she's already had to vote for Kavanaugh, which has made that race competitive for the first time in a long time. And for her to vote with Trump would further weaken her with the middle of Maine.
Right.
And if she went the other way, she opens herself up to a primary challenge, because there is a hard right in Maine, and that might not be very pleasant for her either. So if we
lose her, it also expedites this problem. This larger problem of having no swing voters. I mean, think of it this way. If Jeff Flake were still around, if John McCain were still alive and Jeff Flake were still around, they could conceivably, number one, Lindsey Graham might be different today, I don't know, but they could conceivably team up with Mitt Romney, and now all of a sudden you have that gang of 6 compromise that would take away power, maybe. I'm not a parliamentarian, but that would at least increase the leverage they had over the way McConnell and John Roberts conduct this. So if you get rid of a moderate in Maine and swap in a Democrat, in a way that increases this polarization problem, which is in a way one of the fundamental problems that has created this environment.
Well, I'm going to go a little bit off track from the impeachment discussion, which is fine. One of the reasons why Hickenlooper was reluctant to run for the Senate was that I'm an executive. My skills are bringing people together and getting things done. I don't think being in the Senate's a good fit for my capabilities. And my response always was, if you're a person that brings people together, that's exactly the kind of skill set you want in a senator. And if there's a Democratic president, you're going to be in high demand. You're going to be the fulcrum of power. You and Joe Manchin and John Tester, and if Doug Jones can survive in Alabama, you guys are going to run the show. And Sinema. I don't think if Collins and Gardner lose, I mean, they have not functioned as
Yes,
moderating
exactly.
influences
Right.
in the Trump era. Whereas I think
Yeah,
in a
it's hard
Democratic
to argue
presidency,
that we have to- it's hard to argue that we have to protect them as, this bulwark against polarization when there's no difference functionally. There's no difference between them and Mick Mulvaney is a bad example. Jim Jordan,
right. Anyway, I argued back in the Kavanaugh and Gorsuch nominations that Collins should have played that role. Collins should have made a gang to say, Donald Trump, you don't get to dictate who this nominee is.
Yep.
We're going to ensure that this seat that was blocked from Obama's nominee is going to be a bipartisan unifying pick. She had the capability to do that. It would have been on brand for her. It would have helped her in Maine, but she let her own partisan sentiments overwhelm that. And I think I don't think it's helping her in a race. But so if she's gone, just as much as we're learning there's a moderate faction of the Democratic base, there's a moderate faction of the Democratic Senate, and they're going to throw their weight around. So I say this one to note that I think Hickenlooper made the right choice. There is now going to be some pressure, I think, put on Steve Bullock to run for Senate in in Montana, and he has suggested, like Hickenlooper, I would never run for the Senate. Last thing on my mind, I'm not that kind of a guy. But he's not running for re-election. His lieutenant governor is. He's already not in that race. So he's either out of a political job or he's running for Senate. And I think that the people can make the case that, hey, if you win, you are going to be in demand. You are going to be able to dictate, along with Hickenlooper and Manchin and Sinema and others, how policy gets made in Washington.
And let me just sort of reiterate, this could change. I may feel very differently about this in a year or two, and the pendulum will swing, and I will devote my time to, going after the left. But it feels right now like those moderate Democrats are the most decent, sane, serious, competent people in politics. In fact, they're the only decent, sane, competent, people. And that's weird, in my opinion. But that's the way I see it today from Lake Wobegon.
Now, this also, I mean, Biden has been suggesting this on his stump speeches that not only he's the best guy to beat Trump, and you can debate whether that's true or not based on the available polling data, he certainly is in a good position to beat Trump. That's at minimum true. He's also arguing, I'm your better choice to win down ballot. You need me at the top of the ticket to make it easier for us to win in places like Georgia. And I would certainly expect, like if Steve Bullock got into the race in Montana, he'd be much more comfortable saying, I want to work with a Joe Biden and a Joe Manchin. I'm not gonna go hard left. I'm not gonna go against the wishes of my fellow Montanans. Whereas if it's Bernie or Warren, that's arguably trickier for him to do, unless you believe that their prairie populism is going to light the state on fire. I mean, some people believe that, but I don't think Bullock believes that, and I think he'd be much more comfortable with buying the top of the ticket. So I would not be surprised if that becomes more of the conversation. And this is where Iowa is such an interesting state to go first, because there's this debate over whether Iowa should go first, and it used to be that people in the middle of the party complained that Iowa going first dragged the party too far to the left. There's a caucus, there's all the activists, there's all the peaceniks. They are not picking the person that's going to be the best choice for us to win in the general. And now it's folks from the left who are arguing we shouldn't have this all-white state dictate who the nominee should be because we win with a diverse coalition. We need voices of people of color to have a strong say in who the nominee is. And what I think both arguments are missing is that, yes, Iowa has a pretty far-left electorate relative to the rest of the country, but it's still Iowa. It's still the Midwest. the folks there are pretty acutely aware that certain candidates don't fly nationally. They haven't. They turned away from Howard Dean. They came close with Bernie, but didn't go all the way there. They never went with Dennis Kucinich. They took a flyer on Obama and it worked out, but he also had a Midwestern sensibility. I think that he gave a confidence that he could win nationwide. So it's not a given that Iowa goes hard left all the time, and it's not even the case that Iowa dictates the final nominee, because the last two times Iowa hasn't even dictated what happens in New Hampshire, and it's South Carolina and those African American voices that have had a much stronger say. So the Democrats have created a system where there is a diverse point of view that comes into the decision making process, and that black voice has a strong moderate bent. So it's not like bringing them in shifts the party farther to the left. The whole of all that is, I still think it's very likely that we get a more moderate nominee and not a Bernie or a Warren. But again, we'll see how the debates go today and how the next 6 weeks goes.
Indeed, man. All right. Well, we could keep going, but
it has been almost an hour, and we can't game out the whole debate because it hasn't happened yet. I'm sorry we couldn't tape on Friday. I do encourage folks. I had a piece that ran in Politico late last week after we taped about whether Warren and Buttigieg needed to execute some kind of a pivot, because while Warren and Sanders are more closely aligned ideologically, Warren and Buttigieg are a little more closer aligned demographically. And it is that college-educated, white, affluent voter that has often propelled a dark horse candidate into being a media sensation early in the process. But most of the time, that candidate doesn't actually get the nomination. They can't expand their support to non-college whites or to African Americans more broadly, and the candidate falters. So what does a Warren or a Buttigieg need to do to broaden that support? Do they need to pivot, or is it just a question of being true to yourself and just sticking with what got you this far? And I had the pleasure of interviewing Gary Hart and get his direct thoughts, and the campaign managers for the Paul Tsongas campaign and the Paul Simon campaign, which I think I mentioned on a previous show. The Simon trajectory, to my mind, kind of resembles the Buttigieg trajectory in Iowa, where you break out in a November poll, but then the attacks come and it gets more difficult. It's a pretty deep piece. So I encourage folks to take a look at it and soak it all in.
Awesome. So I wrote a piece at the Daily Beast, which has now been liberated from behind the paywall, about Republican attacks on founding fathers and other presidents. Basically, instead of trying to elevate Trump to their level, they've decided to bring the past presidents of the United States of America down to Trump's level and argue that they were all bad. They were all cheaters. They should have all been impeached. Speaking of cheaters, I'm dealing with some throat stuff issues here. I apologize. I just interviewed the author of this book, Cheaters Always Win, J.M. Finster, and so check out my podcast, Matt Lewis in the News. Interesting conversation. We didn't just talk about Trump. We talked about the New England Patriots as well.
I will say this, Matt. There was a Virginia election in George Washington's early career where he did cheat.
There you go. Maybe he should have been impeached too. What a bastard! And I heard he didn't even chop down that cherry tree. Shameless self-promotion because it's the holiday season. Bill, supporters of my podcast can get a signed copy of Matt Lewis's book, Too Dumb to Fail.
It has stayed relevant. It is not.
It really has.
It is not outdated.
It has aged well. Coffee cups, coffee mugs. I've got. You just saw, the audience didn't see, but before we started taping, my wife was wearing one of my Human Scum, proud to be Human Scum t-shirts, which are available at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. Lots of merch. What a great stocking stuffer this would make this time of year. So anyway, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy New Year. So I'm not sure we can talk next week during the Christmas week, but maybe I think New Year's is Wednesday, right? So the 2nd is the Thursday?
Yeah.
So maybe
we could potentially do in between. Who knows? I'll have my people talk to your people.
Okay.
But I think that, in years past, we have had a very special episode where we've listed our who's up and who's down, who won 2019, those kind of year-end episodes. So we could do a very special. I don't know. We'll see what
let's try to work it out.
Sort out to the fans. Yeah.
Try to work it out. All right. Till then, a merry impeachment to you, and we'll talk as soon as we can.
All right. See you guys later.
Bye.